Hello, and thank you for tuning in. I wanted to share this presentation that I had done the other day at Pasadena City College called Unconquered, Uncharted, and Unconverted, the Frayed Edges of the Spanish Empire. Now, this title should strike us right off the bat as perhaps a little strange because a lot of times we're used to thinking of Spanish power, especially Spanish colonial power, as total. That is, that they controlled aspects of lives down to finite detail so that people didn't really have much freedom under them, right? Well, I want to assemble evidence here that shows that people actually had more freedoms than we tend to think of underneath Spanish power. And recent scholarship backs that up. And I also want to draw attention to sources of these stereotypes that we have about Spain limiting everyone's power during the colonial period. So knowing that Spanish power was not total has two implications for us. First of all, if it's not total, then we can understand that Anglo-centric narratives interfere with our understanding of history, with our interpretation of history. And we're going to focus on that more a little later on. Also, knowing that Spanish power was not total allows us to establish stronger links between the ancestral past of the Americas and today. And these are links which the Spanish could not touch. They did not touch them, and I believe, indeed, that the evidence shows that they could not touch them. They lacked the capacity to influence everything in a totalitarian manner. So focusing on some recent scholarship here, we have this fantastic volume by Etelia Ruiz Medrano and Susan Kellogg called Negotiation Within Domination. It says, New Spain's Indian pueblos confront the Spanish state. And this is certainly the case. Inside this edited volume, we have chapters that show how, through a clever and skillful use of the legal system, indigenous nobles and commoners were able to secure land grants, tribute exemptions, and cash payments from the Spaniards, as well as many noble privileges and titles. So we see that it's not a case of the Spanish actually controlling everyone, but that they had freedom to move within the Spanish legal system, and indeed they did so. And one of the most interesting things that we see in here is that their pictorial texts, such as the one pictured on the cover, were actual accepted evidence in Spanish courts in colonial Mexico. So the Spaniards recognized these documents that the indigenous people brought as actual evidence demonstrating hereditary rights and so forth. So this is a great way to approach the colonial period that sheds some more light on the way that indigenous people actually did exercise their power and access to the legal system. Along similar lines, we have Matthew Restall's recent book, which is The 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. Here he goes straight for popular stereotypes that we often hear handed down to us. First of all, that the Spaniards or the conquistadors were somehow exceptional military tacticians, or they were somehow very accomplished men. He delves into the biographies of such men as Francisco Pizarro and Hernán Cortés and shows that there was really not much exceptional about them, particularly Francisco Pizarro, who, before becoming a soldier, had been a herder. He had herded sheep and goats in Extremadura. Similarly, Hernán Cortés came from Extremadura, from a somewhat affluent family, but they were the lowest level of nobility, called hidalgos. So, and another myth that he comes after here and does very successfully is the idea that Spain entirely wiped out indigenous influence and indigenous civilizations. It's certainly not the case, and as we're going to look at later on, there are many examples of ways in which indigenous culture flourished during and ever since the colonial period. So here we have a definite, very highly researched and well annotated study of how the Spaniards did not have the power that popular representations usually confer to them. So I want to read a little quote here from Leslie Bethel, who wrote a book called Colonial Spanish America. And just to summarize what she says, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. She lists the areas that were unconquered, that is to say that the Spaniards were not able to subdue for at least most of the colonial period. Northern Mexico, Florida, central Chile, which we're going to focus on a little bit ahead, and the Argentine Pampas. We also have Indian rebellions in Peru in the 1530s and the 18th century, notably the Tupac Amaru rebellion. We have rebellions in New Mexico in the late 17th century, where they thwarted Spanish controls and even were successful in establishing independent states that were completely ungovernable. Also, there are many records of indigenous peoples who flee Spanish urban centers and establish their power in a way that the Spaniards cannot control, and they are unsuccessful in collecting tribute. Now, tied in with this whole idea, Spain as entirely totalitarian and controlling people's lives, is this idea of subtraction stories, which I'd like to draw our attention to. This is a concept from the philosopher Charles Taylor in his book, There, A Secular Age. Now, subtraction stories come from our present view of history, and we look at the past, and a priori, without any evidence, we retell the past as only oppressive. But there's evidence that exists that shows that certain freedoms existed in the past that no longer exist. One that comes to mind right away has to do with the movement of people from one territory to another. Before the 17th century, the idea that you had to show papers in order to move from one territory to another was unthinkable. Especially poor common people had the possibility of moving from one place to another, although most people chose to stay in the place where they were born. But before the rise of the nation state, we don't have this necessity to show papers or a passport to pass between territories. Also, if we think about the situation of the rich in the past, they had to marry in order to maintain their status, whereas poor people or common people had possibility more often than not to marry for love. They could marry for love. Also, rich folks, say in medieval Europe, could not leave their castles or estates without exposing their possessions to attack, and so in a certain sense they're less free in the past than perhaps wealthy people are today. Now, subtraction stories also reinforce the idea that our lives in the present are superior to those of people in the past. That is to say, our experiences are more authentic, we have a better vantage point than they did, hence we are smarter, and our lives somehow count more or matter more than the ones in the past. This, of course, this tendency subtraction stories, meaning that the subtraction stories ignore the positive contributions of the marginalized everyday people in the past, the people who are really making history. And so we have to bear in mind that there's a certain danger when we look at the colonial period and we assume that all Spaniards were violent, and we assume that every past situation during the colonial period was oppressive. So moving into more specifics here, with the Unconquered, I want to draw our attention to a few concrete examples. The first one comes from the Mixton Wars, which were during the 1540s, and even later after that there were more skirmishes. This comes from an indigenous painted document called the Lienzo of Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcaltecos were allies of Hernan Cortés during the conquest of Mexico Tenochtitlan. In fact, Hernan Cortés could not have conquered alone or with just his small force that he had with him. Hence, he contracted an agreement with the Tlaxcaltecos that he would help to take down the imperial Triple Alliance, the Mexica, Tacuba, and Texcoco, who together, the three of them together, are called the Triple Alliance, or popularly known as the Aztecs. In any case, after the conquest in 1521, the Tlaxcaltecos received several privileges from the Spaniards, such as tribute exemption and the possibility of owning horses and dressing like Spanish nobles, which several of them did. Here in this depiction, we see that they are retaining their traditional dress. But in any case, they have gone with the Spaniards into northern Mexico to subdue or fight against a people who they call the Chichimeca. Now, there's an urban legend out there about the word Chichimeca, saying that it means people of the dog, from the word chichi in Nahuatl. But we have to recall that Nahuatl actually has long vowel sounds in it. And so why would a people call themselves people of the dog? There's another word, chi-chi, right, which of course means breast. And so we have people of the motherland, right? People of the motherland, people of the breast, people of the motherland. That's what they called themselves because even as the Mexica themselves believed, their ancestors came from the north. And so the word Chichimeca is meant to show antiquity. And it's through the Mixton Wars that this stereotype comes out of Chichimeca, meaning people of the dog. Now, that aside, we see a complex situation of power. The Spaniards are not entirely controlling the Tlaxcaltecos, and they have not been successful in controlling the Chichimecas. The Tlaxcaltecos are fighting on the side of the Spaniards in order to subdue or conquer the Chichimecas, and they were not successful at their first attempt. It took several waves of attacks in order to get the Chichimecas to agree to pay tribute, which is what the Spaniards wanted. The Spanish were interested in tribute payments primarily. Of the Spanish inability to conquer comes from the Mayan zone, which is basically the Yucatan Peninsula and what is Chiapas and Tabasco today off to this area. But just a reminder that in Santo Domingo and Habana, Cuba, right, Cuba, those were the centers of Spanish government before the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. The Spaniards sent 3 expeditions to the Yucatan Peninsula to try to settle or attack or make incursions into the land to see what was there. And those first 3 attempts were unsuccessful. As a matter of fact, they resulted in a great loss of life to the Spaniards, and they saw that it would not be possible for them to go unless they had a greater amount of men. When Cortés came, he only stopped momentarily in Yucatan because of that tremendous reputation that they had and the failures that the Spaniards had previously encountered in Yucatan. He stopped here momentarily and then continued on to Veracruz, which is where he made his first landfall and started journeying towards the capital of Mexico, Tenochtitlan. So the Mayan zone again illustrates the limits of Spanish power. Rebellions occurred there throughout the 16th century and even up into the 18th century. Here's what Robert Patch, the historian, has to say about Mayan resilience to Spanish power. He has a book called Mayan Revolt and Revolution in the 18th Century. Here's what he says, quote, "Despite 2 centuries of Christian indoctrination and Spanish colonialism, the Mayans still believed that history moved in cycles. They held on to core cultural beliefs and saw Spanish rule as simply a phase that would eventually pass. Spaniards thus became simply one more conquering group, like the Toltecs or the Putin Mayan before them, who would eventually be overthrown and absorbed by the native people." End quote. So, due to the strength of their culture and their unwillingness to abandon their ideas of cyclical time and their rituals, they envisioned the Spaniards as temporary intruders, temporary invaders, who would eventually leave. Another of people who remained unconquered are the Mapuche, as Leslie Bethel mentioned, of central and southern Chile. They were so resistant to the Spanish that the Spanish were completely unable to conquer them. As a matter of fact, they did not come under the power of a Western government until after Chile's independence with Spain, when the Chilean government went and negotiated with the Mapuche leaders, and the Mapuche leaders conceded that they would accept the territory as nominally Chilean and that they would consider paying taxes. But it was a very long and difficult fight for the Spaniards, and the Spaniards were not able to conquer the Mapuche people. Now, there are other places, too, worth mentioning quickly that presented geographic or topographical obstacles to absolute control, like we might envision, right? The first of these I want to mention is the Darien, which is what we now call Panama and northern Colombia. The land here is so swampy and had so many problems with malaria-carrying mosquitoes that the Spaniards were not able to conquer and settle here, with the exception of the city of Portobelo, which was on the Caribbean side. Aside from that city, they were not able to make successful incursions into this territory. As we know, of course, it wasn't until the United States came in the early 20th century and they had developed a treatment for malaria that they were able to dig the Panama Canal here. Before that, it was a very dangerous proposition even to be there. Another area which is worth mentioning are the Central Plains in the U.S., the Great Plains, what is now called the U.S. The Spaniards called the whole area that is now the U.S., they called it La Florida, which of course remains intact in one state. Now in the Central Plains, the native plain grass, prairie grass, was about 6 feet tall. So when explorers such as Coronado and De Soto went north and tried to move through that grass, it was very difficult for them. So They did not see the place as ultimately habitable. There were no minerals there, and they did not see it as a profitable territory to settle in any great numbers. Much to the credit of the Native Americans who lived there, the Native Americans lived in harmony with the natural surroundings and with the buffalo. The buffalo were the only force that was capable of trampling down that 6-foot-high prairie grass, and they made trails that went roughly from north to south, reflecting their migration patterns. Of course, the Native American groups knew this, and they followed the buffalo, using those buffalo trails that had pounded down the grass so that they were able to move around. Of course, the Spaniards are very unaware of this, and trudging through this difficult grass, these high, thick grasses, slashing at it with their swords and trying to get their horses through it, which proved very unsuccessful. Now, in general, it's worthwhile to draw a distinction at this point. We can say that in urban areas, such as Mexico City, or Lima, or Buenos Aires, or Cartagena, the Spaniards might expect to be able to exert a certain amount of control, especially when it came to tribute collection, such as knowing where people live, having baptismal records, having soldiers there, and those kinds of authoritarian measures. However, as soon as one ventured into the hinterlands of the countryside, the Spanish control diminished drastically. And we even have records of this from the 17th century in Mexico City, where there were many floods that caused people to leave. And during those years, when people left the city, tribute collection plummeted. And there was nothing that the Spaniards could do about it, because they simply lacked the military capacity to enforce their tribute desires. Moving on, let's talk about the areas about which Spain knew nothing. That is to say, we're not talking just about unconquered areas, we're talking about uncharted areas. They didn't even know what was there. This is certainly a logical consequence of not being able to conquer every region and not being able to control every region. However, what's surprising are the very sizes of these places, where they knew that there was territory, but they knew very little. One prominent example is the Orinoco River, which of course flows through what is now Venezuela. And it runs very long. Not as long as the Amazon, but it's still quite a long river. And you can see the river basin right here. It takes up most of Venezuela, central Venezuela. Now, it wasn't until the 18th century, until the 1700s, until almost the twilight, or the very end of Spanish rule, that they were able to send Jesuits in there, Jesuit priests who reconnoitered the place, who charted it, who sent drawings back to Spain to show what was going on there. And before that, they knew nothing. And they were not collecting tribute, and the folks there were indeed not, quote-unquote, conquered. The Argentine Pampas, similarly, were unmapped, as well as many regions of the Andes, which were difficult to access. We have the same problem of a lack of charts and a lack of understanding in the northern parts of Spanish territory in the Americas. A great example of this comes from the controversy surrounding California. Now, California, the name actually comes from a book of chivalry which Spanish soldiers read, and the book was called La Reina de Calafia, the Queen of Calafia, right? So they named California after this romantic book of quests, fighting dragons, rescuing damsels in distress. That is where the name California comes from. Now, in the book, Calafia was an island, And so in the popular imagination of the Spaniards, they envisioned that California had to be an island. And judging from Baja California, of course it's a peninsula, they assumed that you could keep sailing up the coast of it and you would eventually sail around the island. No one had successfully attempted this or actually proven it. So it wasn't until 1701, wasn't until the 18th century when we have the priest Eusebio Kino, who worked in now what we call Arizona, who crossed the Gila River and effectively understood that California is indeed not an island. As a matter of fact, it's part of the mainland. And so it wasn't until the 18th century, it wasn't until Spain had been around in the Americas for almost 300 years that they learned this simple fact, due to their lack of charting. As we move on here, we want to move to those peoples and those areas which remained unconverted. Now, we previously discussed the Chichimeca and the Mixton Wars, but here I want to present a whole group of other peoples whose beliefs remained during the colonial period and even up to this day, where they were publicly and proudly not Christian. Now, for another presentation or another talk, I could show that there were many different approaches to Christianity, which were indeed authentically native and authentically Christian, and negotiated on their terms. But these are groups who have decided to never convert, to never embrace Christianity by and large. I'll put these names here so that you can look them up and learn more a little bit, and in another talk I can expand on these. But we have the Chichimeca, as we've discussed. There's the Tarahumara and Yaqui peyote hunt, which continues today, the peyote rituals. There are the Mapuche in Chile, who clung to their ancestral monistic view that they called Amarpu and did not embrace Christianity. There are festivals and rituals in isolated areas of Mexico today, such as Chicontepec in Veracruz, areas in Guerrero, and of course in the Mayan zone we have in Chiapas. And that last one in the first column there, we have San Juan de Chamula, which is an interesting church in Chiapas, which is now excommunicated because native practitioners have gone in, taken over the sanctuary, and used all the Catholic icons there simply as placeholders for their traditional deities. So they pulled out all the pews, they've covered the ground in pine needles, and they kneel before these icons and say prayers to their traditional deities. So this continues to this day. You can go see it in Chiapas. In the next column here, we have the Unconquered rebellion in the Andes, which was use of ritual dance to subvert Christianity. We have the character Juan Teton in Los Anales de Juan Bautista, and he was a preacher who stood on the street and said, "Come to me and I will give you a baptism that will wash off the baptism that the Spaniards gave you, so that you can return to traditional ways." So a very interesting appropriation and subversion of Christianity at the same token. There's Francisco de Tanamastli, who was a Chichimeca, who was tried under the Spanish Inquisition for blasphemy. He did not accept Christianity and was very successful in thwarting Spanish attacks. He gathered his men and hid in the rocky outcroppings in remote places in northern New Spain, and always threw rocks at the Spaniards and killed several of them. There's the earlier trial of Don Carlos Ometochsin, who was tried for blasphemy and bigamy. He had multiple wives, tried in 1537. His execution led to the removal of the Inquisitor Juan de Zumárraga from power in Mexico. Which, of course, this is a topic for another talk, but just so you can look it up to see that there was plenty of resistance to Christianity. And we have the Tupac Amaru rebellion in the Andes in the 18th century, which similarly sought to recuperate traditional ways. Now, as a caveat, as I've mentioned before, there were many indigenous approaches to Christianity, which I can outline at another time. So one of the reasons that the Spaniards, just to kind of wrap this up and conclude, one of the reasons why the Spanish were not able to fully control the territory was the limits of their technology. They had limited weapons, as we've alluded to before. Hernán Cortés had to make an alliance with Tlaxcala in order to conquer Mexico. Also, they had limited technologies of communication. Letter delivery was very slow, and so the communication was very slow. It took an average of 6 months to send a letter from Mexico City and receive a reply from Madrid, which meant that the whole colonial administration was terribly slow moving, and that people, especially who lived on the fringes of Spanish influence, which is really just outside of cities, were able to follow their traditional patterns of life in many ways. Another limit to Spanish technology was that tribute collection was only possible in person, which meant that outside of towns or urbanized areas, the tribute collection was virtually non-existent. What Spanish were generally interested in, Spanish administrators, was tribute and order, and probably in that order, as William Connell, the historian, has commented in his book. So, in terms of communication as well, we should mention that it was not even possible for any government to know what's going on at all times in all regions of its territory. It wasn't possible until the 18th century, when the French invented rapid communication over distances via semaphore technology, which was a series of towers where they would send signals with flags and with movable wooden arms in order to send a signal from one tower to another and relay it over vast territory. Of course, in the 19th century, we have the invention of the telegraph and railroads, which really makes knowing what's going on in your territory at all times possible. So returning to our beginning, to our thesis, right, this whole idea of total power is problematic. We have an Anglo-centric view of history, which I believe has come about during the 19th century. It came about in the 19th century, first of all, from the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century, and earlier from the Mexican-American War, when soldiers from the United States were indoctrinated in this idea that Spanish-speaking people are the enemy, and that they're violent, and that we have to civilize them, and that somehow the bearers of the English language are more civilized than the bearers of the Spanish language, which is a stereotype that remains with us to this day. There's an important book that came out in 1843 by a gentleman by the name of William Prescott called The Conquest of Mexico, which is a literary history which embellishes greatly on the events of the conquest and paints the Spaniards as innately more violent than other peoples. So in addition to that, we have this problem of cultural trauma from totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. So when we think of the colonial past, we tend to think that it was just as oppressive as the Nazis, or just as oppressive as Stalin or the Khmer Rouge, or just as oppressive as the United States treatment of Japanese people in the internment camps here, or just as oppressive as the United States government treatment of indigenous peoples in the 19th and 20th century, and boarding schools, etc., and massacres and these terrible things. When we look back at the 16th and 17th centuries, the Spaniards simply don't have the technology to do that, nor in the majority of cases do they have the desire to do that, because they want to collect the tribute. Now, knowing that this is true, that Spain's power was not total, allows us to approach the past in a different manner, and to see that there were many fissures in the power that allowed for indigenous culture to proceed uninhibited in many areas, and it has had a great effect on us in the Americas in general. And we want to remember these forgotten lives, which is what we will continue to do in the series of lectures and writing ahead. Thank you very much.